Welcome to Sunday Mornings at the Marxist Library, a project of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. You can find more information about ICSS at icssmarx.org. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the internet shortly. The continent of Africa is developing rapidly and playing an increasingly important role in world affairs. In the socio-economic West, journalism pays scant attention to Africa, but when it does, it more often than not spews crude propaganda, while bourgeois scholarship is mostly at the service of imperial policymakers. It is necessary for Marxists to pay more attention to Africa in our understanding of the global system, and of course, to be able to act in solidarity with its people's struggles for liberation. In this regard, we're fortunate to welcome back to Sunday Mornings at the Marxist Library the San Francisco Bay Area-based, award-winning independent journalist Ann Garrison. She's a contributing editor at the Black Agenda Report, a producer and reporter on the Pacifica Radio Network, and a contributor to the San Francisco Bay View newspaper and numerous other outlets. Our previous presentation, along with Elias Amare at Sunday Mornings, was entitled The U.S. in the Horn of Africa. A link to that program, as well as previous programs, can be found on our website, ICSSmarx.org. Ms. Garrison's presentation today is entitled Reconsidering the Rwanda Genocide and its Impact 30 Years On. After she speaks, there will be time for questions and answers and comments from our Zoom attendees. So without further ado, please welcome Ann Garrison.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming and imagining that I might have something to say. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide, and I'm going to talk about that, focusing particularly on the pact between Israel and Rwanda. First, let me warn you that we could all be thrown in prison in Rwanda just for having this conversation, because it's against the law in Rwanda to say Rwandan genocide. If we were in Rwanda, police would have broken down all our doors by now. The legally codified and enforced description is genocide against the Tutsi. That's what you have to call it in Rwanda. Genocide against the Tutsi. You're not supposed to say Rwandan genocide, and you're not supposed to say that Hutu people were also killed before, during, and after the genocide, but they were. Saying so is illegal because the whole foundation of the current President Paul Kagame's rule is that only Tutsis and moderate Hutus who protected them died, and that he was the savior who stopped the genocide. I couldn't go to Rwanda without getting thrown in prison or disappeared. It's such a totalitarian regime, so unwilling to tolerate a single word of dissent, that I once filed an assault complaint against some of the government's representatives at a conference at Sacramento State University. This was a conference about genocide denial, negationism, revisionism. It was, to some degree about genocide in general, but the real focus was on Rwanda. And in a breakout session there, I simply asked, well, what about the Garrison report? What about the UN reports from 2001 to 2008? What about the Garrison report? What about the UN mapping report on human rights abuse in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? I didn't get through the list before they shut me right down. It just said I was out of order, shut up. And before this was over, a number had surrounded me screaming, and one of them grabbed me by the arm until somebody from the university said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that here. This is an example of how absolutely intolerant, how absolutely opposed to any single word of dissent about their narrative this government and its representatives are. Okay, can we now get our second slide of President Kagame and Benjamin Netanyahu? Okay, here they are, a couple of good-looking guys. This, of course, this is Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, and of course, Israeli President Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm going to talk about their hand-in-glove alliance. But first, let me explain that I'm trying a little experiment here with the slides. Excuse me, I'm going to talk about each one a bit, not all, sometimes with a script, sometimes without. And I'm going to hope that a story emerges as a result. It won't always go from 1 to 2 to 3, but I'm hoping it will add up in the end, and then I'll take some questions. And this is the first time I've ever tried this. When I started putting these slides together, I realized, wow, I should have started this 2 weeks ago, but I didn't have 2 weeks. So I'm going to do the best I can here. Now, to Presidents Kagame and Netanyahu, I want to talk about this first because I think it makes the rest of this easier to understand. These two have a very close alliance that goes back to 1994, the year of the Rwandan Genocide, at the end of which Paul Kagame and his Rwandan Patriotic Front movement seized power in Rwanda. It should be understood here from the start that the Rwandan Genocide was the final 100 days of a 4-year war, and the war had everything to do with what happened. I'll talk more about that later. But this gets very complicated, and it's less so if you keep that in mind, that the Rwandan Genocide was the end of a 4-year and interstate and civil war, at the end of which President Paul Kagame, he was then general, now President Paul Kagame, seized power. Now, within a year of seizing power in Rwanda, President Kagame traveled to Israel, where he received all honors from President Netanyahu. And the two have been blood brothers ever since. Can I get my next slide? Okay, let's see. I was going to read this. Let me see if there's a way I can. Okay, I have to move this. Okay. This is an excerpt from Robin Philpott's book, Rwanda and the New Scramble for Africa, From Tragedy to Useful Imperial Fiction. I'm just going to read this. Two specific events that often go unnoticed contributed to the official sanctioning of the use of the word genocide to describe the entire Rwandan tragedy. The first was a conference held in Kigali, organized by the Office of the President of Rwanda, attended by Ephraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Michael Berenbaum of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, among others. Both were invited to make proposals on the memorialization of genocide. Ephraim Zuroff then became an advisor to the Rwandan government in its hunt for genocidaires. The premise here is that there's an equivalence between the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, and there's going to be a hunt for criminals who've left the country, just like the Nazi hunts. I have some more to say about that later. From that point on, Zionists throughout the world were prepared to share the use of the term with Rwandan Tutsis, which has never been the case for Armenians, largely because of Israel's strategic alliance with Turkey. Now, that's changed. This was published in English. Robin's book was published in English in 2013. Turkey no longer seems to be an ally of Israel. And in fact, Turkey submitted some supporting documents to the International Court of Justice, considering whether or not Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza. Turkey supported these, submitted these supporting documents, and then Israel said, you're the one who's guilty of genocide. You're the one who's guilty of the Armenian genocide. But previously, they had not been able to say that. And that tells you what a political word genocide is. The very political word constantly being struggled over, especially right now. Okay, the second event, less than a year later, was, how can I move this out of the way? I need to move. Let's see, to move this out of the way somehow. Okay, well, I know what it says. The second event was Paul Kagame's official visit to Israel, where he was received by Netanyahu with all honors. Okay, let's see. We're gonna go. Oh, next slide, Isaac Herzog. Okay, this is Isaac Herzog. He's the foreign minister of Israel. He arrived on April 7th in Rwanda for the 30th anniversary commemoration, where President Kagame talked about genocide for an hour without mentioning Gaza. And that was, by the way, the first visit of an Israeli diplomat to an African country since October 7th. He said he was also there for diplomatic talks about how to free the hostages, and there were photographs of him there talking with Bill Clinton. You see, they rolled out the red carpet, which South Africans certainly would not do right now. And
you're muted.
You're muted, Anne.
okay, I have no idea how that happened because I didn't go anywhere near the computer.
You're good now.
Okay, well, let's see. I don't know when I became muted, but let's go back and see. Maybe I told you this, that you see they rolled out the red carpet. Did you hear me say that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, they rolled out the red carpet. Now, can we go back to a slide of Kagame and Netanyahu? That'd be the next slide. Okay. We might say that these two have a devil's pact, but I call it a victim's pact because they both trade in victimization and constantly reinforce one another's victim status. They both constantly make the world feel guilty for not saving their people during the Holocaust and the Rwandan Genocide, and claim victims' privilege to wage wars and occupy other people's lands, Israel in Palestine and Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, of course, they won't say this, but they essentially claim that as genocide victims, they have the right to commit genocide. Next slide, Kagame and Netanyahu with our captions. Okay. This is another handshake that I added a few captions to. Kagame says, you'll share the genocide trademark. Israel has up to now had a lock on the genocide trademark. That's been thrown into question in everything that's happening in Gaza and at the ICJ. But previously that was the case. Netanyahu says, deal, we occupy Palestine, you the DRC. Okay, next slide. Okay, in case you didn't know, Rwanda has been waging war, plundering resources, and occupying territory in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, since 1996. And millions of Congolese people and Rwandan refugees have died as a result. It's millions. It's hard to get your mind around. Okay. In 2004, the International Rescue Committee published a study in which they said that Congo had suffered 3.9 million excess deaths because of the war between 1998 and 2004. Uganda and Burundi invaded with Rwanda in 1996, and all the 9 countries bordering Congo were drawn in by the end of the Second Congo War in 2003, but that's all way more than I can explain today. So I'll just say that Rwanda has been the principal aggressor in the DRC throughout this time and is most responsible. In 2007, 3 years later, the International Rescue Committee said that the wars had caused 5.7 million deaths between 1998 and 2007, nearly 6 million people. It's now 14 years later, but no one has done another study since then. Some authors and journalists project those numbers forward, saying the war is still going on, the displacement, the casualties are continuing. So they project the numbers forward and claim that as many as 10 million people have died, but there's been no methodical study. I wouldn't use that figure because there's just been no methodical study. One has to ask why there's been no further study, just as one has to ask why this is allowed to continue. It's in some part because Kagame has been able to deploy his victimization narrative in support of it. He's constantly saying, I have to go after the people who committed the genocide who are hiding in the DRC. Well, that was 30 years ago. There are Rwandan refugees here who've never been willing to go home for good reason. So for these 30 years, he's claimed that he's hunting down genocide criminals, and this isn't funny. This isn't funny at all. And there are more than 6 million people by now dead as a result. Those guilty of genocide were only a very small percentage of those who fled into DRC. Millions of Rwandans fled the advance of Kagame's army, for good reason, in every direction, into Tanzania and Burundi, but most of all into DRC. Many of them were children and old or sick people, and Kagame's army chased and slaughtered them. The Rwandan army then chased hundreds of thousands of Rwandan refugees through the jungle, the Congolese jungle, to Western Congo and neighboring countries where they sought asylum status. Many died along the way, and they are among the millions dead in these studies by the IRC. The majority by far are Congolese people who had nothing to do with the genocide. This Kagame's army chasing and killing these Rwandan refugees is, like many other crimes, documented in the UN Mapping Report on Human Rights Abuse in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but no one has ever been prosecuted for those crimes. Again, you have to ask why. Why? It's because a lot of people's interests are being served by this situation. Now, I should say a few things about these staggering numbers, millions. First of all, they're what are called excess deaths, deaths that exceed a population's normal mortality rate. And second, the majority are not combat deaths. There are many combat deaths, but the majority are people who died of displacement. So they died of malnourishment. They were eaten by wild animals. They died of easily treated and cured diseases like cholera and diphtheria. And the majority who died were children. There are nearly 7 million displaced persons in DRC. At this point, the only number that rivals it is that in Sudan. The majority of them are in North Kivu province, where the Rwandan army is constantly engaged in war and resource plunder. Rwanda borders North Kivu province, borders the DRC, and at North Kivu province, which is extremely mineral rich, particularly rich in the minerals that feed all our electronics industries. Boy, I'm not used to talking this long. Okay. Next slide. Can we go back to? Okay, here we have President Paul Kagame, Barbara Streisand, Bill Clinton, former Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. This is at Shimon Peres' 90th birthday celebration in 2013. And I'm sharing this in part to demonstrate Kagame's importance to Netanyahu and all that he represents, and vice versa. You have to be a VIP to be seated in this company with these VIPs. I can't think of any other African presidents who would. I'd also like to say here that Bill Clinton was president during the Rwandan Genocide, and he is very, very close to Kagame as well. In 2009, Clinton presented Kagame with one of his Global Citizen Awards amidst a lot of hoopla during the week of all the UN General Assembly speeches in New York City. Okay, next slide. The US did not fail to intervene. Okay, this is the last piece I wrote in the Black Agenda report. It's largely a review of Robin Philpott's book, Rwanda and the New Scramble for Africa, From Tragedy to Useful Imperial Fiction. And I'm more or less going to read a lot of this because it's very, very complicated to explain, and I didn't want to try to write it all over again. Okay. The most widespread and pernicious myth about the Rwandan genocide may be that the US stood by and let it happen. Nothing could be further from the truth. The US, in fact, intervened aggressively. It intervened to make sure that there would be no UN intervention. There were attempts by various European countries, and particularly France, to try to organize an intervention. The US absolutely, and the US had veto power on the UN Security Council, and it would have nothing of it. Robin's book is a classic history. It's as important this year, the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide, as it was upon its English publication in 2013. At its opening, in chapter 7, How is the Empire? He quotes former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who said, "The genocide in Rwanda was 100% the responsibility of the Americans." He quotes Boutros-Ghali's 1999 book, Unvanquished, a US UN saga, in which the former Secretary General writes, "The US effort to prevent the effective deployment of a UN force for Rwanda succeeded with the strong support of Britain." The 1994 genocide took place 3 years after the Soviet Union had collapsed and broken up into 15 independent states. The Cold War was over. The US reigned supreme economically, militarily, politically, with its veto power on the UN Security Council. President Clinton thus sent his UN ambassador, Madeleine Albright, to systematically block any kind of UN military intervention to stop the bloodshed in Rwanda. No intervention would be tolerated, even if the US did not participate. Now, why not? Because the US wanted to see its imperial proxy, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by then General Paul Kagame, seize power in Rwanda's capital, Kigali. It wanted to displace France and the French language and establish itself as the dominant power in East and Central Africa. It wanted ready access to the immense mineral wealth of Rwanda's neighbor, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which Rwanda and Uganda would invade 2 years later. It wanted to destroy the strong state established by the Rwandan Social Revolution of 1962, which overthrew the feudal Tutsi monarchy. This was a state that was resisting neoliberal reform. Kagame's army, the RPF, who carried US interests and the English language into Kigali, were largely Tutsi aristocrats who had taken refuge in Uganda after Rwanda's social revolution. Rwanda had a social revolution in which the Hutu peasantry, who had been oppressed by this feudal Tutsi monarchy, for many, many, many years, was overthrown. The Hutu peasantry overthrew the feudal monarchy, and land was redistributed amongst the peasantry. The popular understanding of the genocide is that it was 100 days of bloodletting in which the country's Hutu majority executed a plan to exterminate the country's Tutsi minority. Few, even in left circles, understand that it was the final 100 days of a 4-year war that began when the army of the Rwandan Patriotic Front invaded Rwanda from Uganda on October 1st, 1990, displacing perhaps as many as 1 million Rwandans over the next 4 years. By the time the Rwandan genocide happened, there were as many as 1 million refugees ringed around the city of Kigali, the capital. And it was like a tinderbox. It exploded when the Rwandan and Burundian presidents were assassinated. They were assassinated by elements of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, who fired surface-to-air missiles at the plane as it was returning from some peace talks in, I guess it was Dar es Salaam. So it's little understood that the US was determined to see its proxy, the RPF, win that war, or that the RPF also committed mass atrocities, including the assassinations of the Rwandan and Burundian presidents, which triggered the panic, chaos, violence, and horror of the next 100 days. And it's little understood that immediately after the assassinations, the RPF broke the ceasefire in the 4-year war, beginning a long-planned military assault to seize power. They resumed the war right after the assassinations, and the population panicked and the genocide began. Robin Philpott cites classified internal Clinton administration documents, which were made available in August 2001, consequent to a Freedom of Information Act request submitted by the Independent National Security Archive. He said, quote, "These memoranda, telegrams, working papers, reports, and briefing documents confirm the worst apprehensions about how a superpower develops and applies a foreign policy in which its own strategic interests take precedence over the lives and the peace of a country, its people, and whole regions of Africa." The Clinton administration was well aware of the enormity of the tragedy unfolding in Rwanda after the RPF assassinated the Rwandan and Burundian presidents. Prudence Bushnell, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the time, Secretary of State warned Christopher of, quote, widespread violence. And Robin Philpott writes, a Pentagon memorandum to Undersecretary of Defense Frank Wisner, who was third in charge, warned that unless both sides can be convinced to return to the peace process, a massive, hundreds of thousands of deaths, bloodbath will ensue. In addition, millions of refugees will flee into neighboring Uganda, Tanzania, and Zaire. So everything was foreseen, but Bill Clinton absolutely refused to allow a UN intervention to go in and stop the carnage. Why did the US push for this in the face of these warnings as the Rwandan army forces were offering a ceasefire? What did they push for? They actually pushed for a drawdown of UN peacekeepers. There were 2,500 UN peacekeepers in the country at the time, and the US pushed for a drawdown from 2,500 to 270, 3 weeks after the assassinations and at the height of the massacres. Earlier, it had successfully pushed for keeping the peacekeepers to 2,500, even though there had been an earlier agreement to increase them to 4,500. Okay, so the US did not stand by. I hope I've convinced you that the US did not stand by and let this happen. It aggressively intervened to make sure that nothing was done until our guy seized power in Kigali. Now, the myth that the US simply stood by and indefinitely let the genocide happen, or even that it wasn't fully aware of what was happening, is a useful imperial fiction. That's what Robin Philpott calls it, a useful imperial fiction. It's since been enshrined in the mission statements of the genocide, what I call the Genocide Prevention Complex, from the US National Holocaust Museum to the US Atrocities Prevention Board. That's an interagency committee consisting of officials from the National Security Council, the Departments of State, Defense, Justice, and Treasury, USAID, and the intelligence community, which meets monthly, putatively and laughably, to assess the long-term risks of atrocities around the world. With epic hypocrisy, President Obama cited Rwanda in the August 11th presidential directive creating the board. He said, 60 years since the Holocaust and 17 years after Rwanda, the United States still lacks a comprehensive policy framework and a corresponding interagency mechanism for preventing and responding to mass atrocities and genocide. This has left us ill prepared to engage early, proactively, and decisively to prevent threats from evolving into large-scale civilian atrocities. By that time, Rwanda had already been profusely cited as an excuse for bombing Libya. After the gory summary execution of Muammar Gaddafi, UN Ambassador Susan Rice landed in Libya, then flew on to Rwanda to pronounce that we got it right this time. The US bombing of Syria, which began in 2014, also followed many months of exhortations to stop the next Rwanda. If you listen, when the US is about to go to war, in recent years, it's always been to stop the next Rwanda. You'll hear that. No one's, but of course, they're not talking about stopping the next Gaza. They're not stopping about they're not talking about stopping the current Gaza. So this whole genocide prevention industrial complex is being exposed by the war in Gaza in the case that the ICJ. Okay. Why don't we go on to, Polina, why don't we go on to these? Oh, that's the thank you. That's the book that I reviewed, and I was reading from some of my review of that book. This is the best book I know of, Rwanda and the New Scramble for Africa, From Tragedy to Useful Imperial Fiction. This is the best book I know of about the geopolitical context of the Rwandan genocide. Next slide. Okay. Here's President Kagame on stage with Shmuley Boteach, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, the author of Kosher Sex, and a rabid Zionist and a rabid advocate for US humanitarian wars. That's the late Elie Wiesel. These three have appeared a number of times together to advocate for US wars on the basis that the next Holocaust, the next Rwanda genocide have to be prevented. Again, the most obvious examples of these are Libya and Syria. Next slide. There's Rabbi Shmuley is presenting an award to President Paul Kagame at the 5th Annual Champion of Jewish Values ceremony. Next slide. Okay. This was an event that took place in, I think it's either 2013, yeah, 2013, during the week that the UN General Assembly gathers and representatives from every member state address the entire body. That happens once a week. This happened during that. It's called UN Week. This event was staged at that time. And Paul Kagame, Elie Wiesel, Shmuley Boteach, Sheldon Adelson, the casino billionaire, no, deceased now, but the casino billionaire, and among the most rabid Zionists in the world, Michael Steinhardt, another Zionist billionaire, all on this panel.
And froze.
Anything else? Anything else we can do about this? Emmett?
No, can we maybe send a chat to Anne? She should hear us, but let's try to see if we can. I'm sending her.
Okay.
Oh, I think she dropped out. I think she dropped
Okay.
out of the session.
Okay, we'll wait a
Yeah.
minute and hopefully she'll log back in.
Right.
Can I say
Um,
something?
Yeah,
Sure.
May I say something, please? My
Go
name
ahead.
is Dr. Deborah Greenwood, and I'm here because I actually live in Kigali, Rwanda. And I wanted to make sure that I could express my experiences of living here and my understanding of the history of this country. And I think a lot has not been said that needs to be said. So I hope
Okay.
I'll be
Well,
granted some time to
I think
to-
we'll give you some time
add
at
my
the,
perspective.
yeah,
Mhm.
The way that the format goes is that the presenter presents the subject, and then we go into Q&A, the questions and answers, and everybody gets like 2 minutes to express their views and get a response from the speaker. So we'll definitely do that.
Just so you know, I'll need more than 2 minutes.
We'll
see about- we'll
see
see.
if. Yeah, we are waiting for Anne to rejoin the session at this point.
are you logging in from Rwanda, Deborah?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
While we're waiting, I've lived here for 2.5 years, and this is now my new home. And
Okay.
I'd certainly love to share with you why I made that
well,
decision.
if you go ahead a little bit, but when Anne comes back, we'll go straight back to her. Okay,
That's fine.
okay, go ahead.
Couple things that I wanted to just set the record straight on. She was saying that the war started 4 years before 1994. Actually, if you really want to deep dive into history, in pre-colonial times, the Tutsi had a certain role. They were the cattle people. The Hutus tended to be more the farmers, and the Twa people were more the like hunter-gatherers. There was intermarriage. The culture was the same. They lived in the same country. It wasn't until the colonists came that they started making differences between the people. There was intermarriage. There were not wars. There was peace. And it wasn't until the colonists came and started favoring the Tutsis and issuing the passes like they did in South Africa and doing the measurement of the nose and all that crapola, that these ethnic divisions began. And it was actually in 1959 that the campaign against the Tutsi was actually started. And
Anne now
that-
is joining us, I
Okay.
believe. Yeah,
Now
so we
wait.
can.
Mhm,
All right, thank you, thank you.
mhm.
So, can you make Raj? Can you make Anne again the co-host so she can control the screen? Hello.
Yeah, I was getting a call from Richard there, but
That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay.
me again. Okay. So sorry for my poor planning. I let the battery run down on my laptop. So please excuse me.
Okay.
think- Go ahead.
Paulina,
You go ahead.
are
You
you
go
sharing
ahead,
the
Anne.
screen?
Is Paulina here?
I'm here. I'm
Yeah.
sharing the screen at the same place where we stopped.
Okay, yeah, I was showing you some slides of the instances of the collaboration between Kagame and Netanyahu, between Rwanda and Israel, in this victim status and this argument for US wars based on this idea that we have to stop the next Holocaust or the next Rwanda.
And if I can interrupt for 1 minute, Paulina, would you mind sharing the screen once again, please? It's not showing what it should be, I believe.
Oh, it's showing me, Anne, can you see what's on my screen right now? Paul Kagame?
I can't see what's on your screen.
Oh, I apologize. Let me try again. Okay,
Okay.
try again.
We were on the Cooper Union slide. This was the event that took place. There we
There
go.
you go. We have it now.
Okay, yeah. Please excuse me for that. It's September 2013. This crew gathers to argue for going to war in Syria to stop the next Rwanda. You can see this as a UN week discussion in prelude to the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide and the international response to the Syrian chemical slaughter. That is the alleged chemical weapons attack that was disproven by journalist Aaron Mate quite conclusively. Nevertheless, the U.S. started bombing Syria, and pretty soon every NATO country was required to fly by and drop a few bombs on Syria every once in a while. Okay, so next slide. Okay. This was another attempt. This was another case in which the Stop the Next Rwanda ideology was deployed. Some of you might know that I went to Ethiopia in 2022. There was a civil war going on in Ethiopia in 2022, and the US proxy was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which started the war. The Tigray People's Liberation Front had been in power for about 30 years before it was 27 years before it was displaced by a popular uprising. And in 2020, 2 years later, it launched a war to reclaim power. And the TPLF had been the US proxy in the region for all those years. And so it was eager to see the TPLF win that war. And the ideology, the genocide prevention ideology, was deployed. President Kagame stepped in to be involved, as he was in those other slides that I showed you. Here he appeared in some kind of conversation with this hashtag Tigray genocide banner. Hashtag Tigray genocide was a common hashtag on Twitter at the time. Now, people then thought, Ethiopians were terrified when this began, that they were going to be the next Libya, the next Syria, or the next Yugoslavia. The country is a patchwork of ethnicities. There are 80 languages. I can't remember how many ethnic groups, but there are 3 dominant ethnic groups, the Tigrayans, the Amhara, and the Oromo, who are constantly competing for power. So it is to some degree fragile, vulnerable, like Yugoslavia, to being broken up. That was another fear here. At the beginning, I thought it was quite possible that the US would intervene and Kagame offered to contribute troops to an intervention. That's what this was about. In the end, they decided not to do that. I think it's because they concluded that the TPLF was not viable, would not be able to return to power and hold on to it. So this was a case in which the whole genocide ideology of genocide prevention was deployed. Eventually, it was dropped. So next slide. Okay, when I was in Ethiopia, I was with several people driving around the downtown, and we came to the Rwandan embassy. I saw this outside, and I said, wait a minute, we have to circle back. You have to circle the block so that I can take a picture of this. This banner is hanging outside the Rwandan embassy. It says 28th commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And you know, it's the genocide against the Tutsi, not the Rwandan genocide in Rwanda. This was July, and this anniversary had been, they celebrated on April 7th. So many months later, this is still hanging. For all I know, it was hanging there all year. The next year, I got in touch with a friend of mine in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, and asked him to go by the embassy and see if another banner was hanging out there. And he said, absolutely it was. At this time, it said the 29th commemoration of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. What this demonstrates is how much this regime, this totalitarian regime, relies on this ideology, this claim that the 1994 genocide was the genocide against the Tutsi. The idea that it was the genocide against the Tutsi and that Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, swooped in to stop it is the whole foundation of that government. Okay, next. Okay, Victoire Ingabire. Now, here I want to talk about how I came to be involved in this story and how Anthony Fest did as well. He's here. I didn't know much about Rwanda in 2010. I knew that Rwanda and Uganda were the aggressors in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I think I've explained. And I had written several articles about the various minerals that are necessary for the electronics industries, and especially the new electronics industries. There was a war that was largely driven by the Sony PlayStation at one point. I mean, I call it a war. There was a lot of fighting over coltan at one point that was really driven by the Sony PlayStation and the demand for it at one time. Anyway, I wrote these articles about the wars over the minerals in the Eastern DRC and noted that Rwanda and Uganda were the principal aggressors. Then I'm a member of the Green Party, and someone from the Green Party asked me, could you find out why Frank Habineza, a member of the Democratic Green Party of Rwanda, could not stand for president? He was trying to run for president in 2010. I said, okay, and I got a hold of Frank Habineza on Skype from Rwanda. And he explained that he had to hold a convention to be able to qualify, to be able to register his party and register as a candidate. Every time he tried to hold a convention, it was busted up by goons. And the bureaucrats would tell him, you haven't met this requirement, you haven't met that requirement, whatever. They were not going to let any viable candidate run. And in the course of this, I met Victoire Ingabire, who was also trying to run for president, and she wasn't having any more luck than he was. They would bury her in paper and say, you haven't done this and you haven't done that, you can't qualify. And controversy was swirling around her, and she was in great danger. When she arrived in Rwanda, she went to Rwanda from the Netherlands, where she had been in exile for quite a few years. She had a great job there, great life, great family. She decided she had to go back because Rwandans were suffering too much. She had to go back and see what she could do, and she was trying to run for president. When she arrived in Rwanda, she went immediately to the Genocide Memorial, where she said, where is the commemoration of the Hutus? That was incendiary, and I think everything that I've said should explain why that was incendiary. It challenged the idea that this was just the genocide against the Tutsi. And I started calling her, I started putting her voice on the radio at KPFA. Most of the time, no one was calling her. Eventually, she got a call or two from the CBC and the BBC. But I was calling her probably every other week for a year. And no, it wasn't a year. It was about 7. It was up until she got arrested. So it was about 8 months, 8 or 9. She was arrested in October that year, and she went to prison for 8 years. She was sentenced to more, but Kagame let her out 8 years later. She's always on the verge of going to prison again. And she is essentially in prison there. She is under, it's not exactly house arrest, but she's not allowed to leave the country. Can we see the next slide? This is her with the handcuffs in 2010 after she'd been arrested, and she was put on trial for genocide ideology, i.e. Asking where the commemoration to the Hutus was, stating that Hutus had been killed before, during, and after the genocide. There was not just the genocide against the Tutsi. She was also accused of trying to inspire the Rwandan people to rise up and overthrow the government. That meant she was trying to run for president. Okay, next slide. This is when she got out of prison. The person standing behind her is a gospel singer, Kizito Mihigo. He was in prison during the same time she was. He was released at the same time. He was also put under this sort of quasi-house arrest where he was let out of prison, but he wasn't allowed to leave the country. He tried to cross the Burundian border. He was apprehended. He was dead a couple of days later, and they said he had committed suicide. That was absolutely heartbreaking. Kizito Mihigo was a hugely popular gospel singer, and he's a Tutsi, and he had recorded a song in which he said that it was important to remember the Hutu as well, that they should also be allowed to mourn their dead. One of the horrible things that goes on here is because of this genocide against the Tutsi ideology, Hutu people are not even allowed to mourn their dead who died during the genocide. Every year there's a commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi, and the Hutu memory of their tragedies is suppressed. Many people say that this is a tinderbox situation, that when you have a minority oppressing the majority like this so extremely for so long, that one academic said it's like the San Andreas Fault. And Paul Rusesabagina of Hotel Rwanda fame who was recently imprisoned. He was imprisoned and then released. There was such an outcry. He described it as a powder keg. Anyway, so right now, Victoire Ingabire is attempting to get out of the country. She asked me to participate in a campaign to let her to leave. She hasn't seen her husband for 14 years, and he's now very, very sick. She's asking to be able to leave the country to see her family. And she's trying to get organizations like the International Women's League for Peace and Freedom, other women's and human rights organizations organized around this. And I suggested I would try to see if I could get some involvement from Code Pink Women for Peace. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is Judy Reaver. She is the author of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. This was a groundbreaking book about what actually happened during the Rwandan genocide. And she demonstrates, done extensive interviews and reviewing UN documents that there was mass systematic, that the Rwanda Patriotic Front committed mass systematic slaughter of Hutu people behind their lines during the Rwanda genocide. She was researching and writing this book. She was harassed and threatened constantly by the Rwandan government. At one point, she was getting phone calls. She lives in Montreal. She was getting phone calls threatening her and threatening her children. She had 2 grammar school age girls, and they let her know that they knew the girls' names. And she suffered such extreme distress that her marriage broke down. She developed an autoimmune disease. She had to be hospitalized, but still she wrote this book. And like Robin Philpott's book, Rwanda and the New Scramble for Africa, this is one of the most important books to read to understand what really happened. Okay, do we have another slide here? How Paul Kagame deliberately sacrificed the Tutsi. This is written by a former member of the Rwandan government, and he comes to the same conclusion that Judy came to, that an election had been scheduled. There had been negotiations to end the civil war in Rwanda. An election had been scheduled. Paul Kagame knew that he could not win that election because a 14% minority ethnic party was not going to win against the majority. So he would have to he would have to share power in a parliamentary government. He couldn't tolerate that. He was absolutely determined to seize power. And this is really macabre, but the way that he did this was to sacrifice the poor Tutsi. He is a Tutsi aristocrat. After the social revolution, the Tutsi aristocrats emigrated to the neighboring countries. He was in Uganda, and the poor Tutsi were left behind. By triggering the genocide, and then he's said to be the savior. He wasn't. He actually stood by and let the genocide of the Tutsis happen, and he even egged it on. He even sent Tutsi commandos in to participate, knowing that his right to rule was going to be based on this mythology that he had saved Tutsis. Hence, how Paul Kagame deliberately sacrificed the Tutsi. Okay, you have another slide? Okay, this is a slide for HutuGenocide.org. Like I said, Hutu people have not been allowed to mourn their dead. Their genocide has not been acknowledged. This website includes a documentation of specific instances, both in Rwanda and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this would just, this drives the Paul Kagame and the government of Rwanda crazy. If you say Hutu genocide, if you say Hutu genocide in Rwanda, you go to prison. If you say it outside Rwanda, you suddenly have people screaming at you that you're a genocide denier, a revisionist, a negationist, etc. Okay, we got another slide. Okay, this is Eric Nshimie. He's an engineer. He's an engineer for the Goodyear tire and rubber company, has been for decades, lives in a suburb of Canton, Ohio, and he's a Catholic, a serious Catholic, a model upstanding citizen, and he's just been arrested for genocide crime. He's actually been arrested by US authorities for immigration fraud, the argument being that he lied on his immigration papers by saying that, by failing to say that he was guilty of genocide in Rwanda. So this is one of many, many such cases like this that I have observed and written about. I have a piece in the Canton Repository, that's Eric's local paper, that was published today, in which I explain the fact that there's a constant witch hunt going on, constant persecution, transnational persecution of the Rwandan diaspora. They're threatened, they're murdered, and there's this form of judicial abuse in which they're suddenly accused of being involved in the Rwandan genocide. Fake witnesses are produced. People are so horrified by the genocide idea, and they've seen Hotel Rwanda, and I've seen people convicted really fast. Basically, the judgment is, oh, he's a Hutu. Okay, he's a Hutu. He must be guilty. He has the best lawyer who's ever defended against these cases, Kurt Kearns. He defended an 80-year-old, he's actually a Burundian Hutu, and the US government spent $1 million trying to deport him and failed. So I'm really hoping that he can get Eric acquitted. Okay, at that point, how about I stop now and take some questions? That sound good?
That sounds good, and thank you very much, Anne.
Okay.
Before we go on to questions, we need to do a few announcements. And I'm going to turn over the moderation for the rest of the session to my good friend Alan Miller, who will take it from here. Thank you. Alan?
Thank you, Richard. Just a couple of quick announcements. We're going to go to a question and answer period after the announcements. If you have questions or comments for Anne, please go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and we will try to get people, try to get everybody in for your questions and comments. So go down to reactions and raise your hand, and we'll call on you. Next week, we have a very special session. Speaking from South Korea is Dae-Han Song, who is an activist who will be talking about recent update on the situation on the Korean Peninsula. There have been some very important developments in the situation, a lot of military escalation on the part of the United States and aligned countries. We want to ask everybody to come back next week and take a listen and participate, find out more about what's going on in South Korea. I want to remind everybody that you can go to our website at ICSSmarks.org, ICSSmarks.org, and there you can sign up for our email notification list, where you will receive notifications of each of our sessions and a Zoom link to each session. You can also view past programs. They're up there, including YouTube videos of many of our programs from recent years. And there's also a contact form where you can reach us with questions, comments, suggestions for topics and speakers. So that's ICSSmarks.org. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead to questions and answers. We're going to ask people to kind of keep them moderately short. We usually about 2 minutes. And I'm going to start off with Deborah. Hi, Deborah.
Hi, Alan.
How are you? Why don't you go ahead?
In order to respect the time, I'm just going to go through my little points all at once. And they're written all over the place. And you were off when I mentioned that I actually live in Rwanda. I've lived here for 2.5 years, and my experience of this country is very different than what you've been talking about. So I just wanted to share some of the my understanding of the history, and I can certainly tell you what it's like to live here. While you were gone, I'll just say briefly, pre-colonial times, there were no ethnic divisions, such as the Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. There was intermarriage, shared culture, same country. And it wasn't until the colonialists, I'm going to call them what they are, the white invaders, the white European invaders. It wasn't until they came and started emphasizing differences and trying to separate people based on their appearance that this conflict among the people began to develop. And I'm going to come back to that. I wanted to start with that, and I want to come back to that as the last thing that I say. And so it wasn't 4 years that led to and please don't call it a civil war when 75% of the Tutsis were killed. It's not a civil war. That is genocide against the Tutsi. So please, let's not call it a civil war and make that mistake and think that, that was what was going on. But 40 years before the genocide took place, it started, there were already attacks on the radio and in the media against the Tutsi. So it didn't just happen that people woke up one day and said, oh, I'm going to kill my neighbor. And the reason that's important is because the brutality of the attacks we had husbands killing their wives. We had parents killing their children, literally throwing their babies against the wall. I've seen the blood because I've gone to some of these memorials. There are memorials all over the country. There's not just one memorial. And the role of moderate Tutsi has been talked about. That has been uplifted. So it's not like the way people may think that, we don't talk about the fact that the Tutsi suffered. That's not true. In fact, let's go on to churches, the role of the church. Some of the people in the Catholic Church were supporters and participants of the genocide. And my favorite story is that there are people who sought refuge and received refuge at the mosque. And they said, well, why the hell am I a Christian? If they're killing us, they became Muslims. That's one of my favorite stories.
It's been more than 2.5 minutes now. Maybe you can try to wrap it up. Yeah, thank you.
I will do that. Let's talk about DRC. DRC has the most wealth of all of Africa, I believe, and the people are the poorest. You think that's because of Paul Kagame, or is it because of the corrupt presidents? DRC hasn't been right since Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. In the cobalt mines, you talked about cobalt. You have women going in there with their children on their back, digging cobalt. If Tshisekedi, the current president, would just do two things, have childcare for those children, and provide safety masks for the people who work in the cobalt mines. You know, my opinion of him would go from -100 to -90. Also about the Rwandans who went into a DRC. First of all, many have lived there historically. You know, these borders were drawn by the Europeans, the invaders. This was not something that the people themselves created. But after the genocide, and so many people went there, DRC was asked, at least move those folks, you know, who want to come back and wage genocide again, at least move them back into the interior of the country. That was refused. And I'm going to end with this. You characterized Kagame as putting forth a victim mentality. Well, he said something at this last genocide speech that really impressed me. He said, never will Rwandans be left for dead again. That doesn't sound like a victim mentality to me. And the thing I'll end with here is that there are no Tutsi in Rwanda today. There are no Hutus. There are no Twas, because he understands that tribalism helps to feed genocidal ideology. And so that's the best thing to me about living here, is that he understands the negative role of tribalism in Africa, and we're not going to let that divide us. We're a united people.
Thank you.
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, Anne, if you want to go ahead and respond, and then we'll have our next question, which actually be Yusuf. So Anne, go ahead.
Hey, Deborah, can I just ask how long you've lived in Rwanda?
2.5 years. Oh, and let me just mention one more thing. There are 120 militia groups in DRC.
Okay. Yes, that's true. But by far, the largest, most dangerous, most brutal, the one that is causing the devastation most of all is the M23, which is
And some would say it's FDLRC or whatever they are. So, you know, we're not going to agree. I didn't say what I had to say to get your, you said your opinion, I've said mine. So
okay, that's fine.
I'm
That's
not really
okay.
saying what I'm saying to get a response from you. I'm just speaking my truth as someone who lives here, as someone who reads, who's, you know, and I want to recommend 3 things for you all to read. One is the Walter Rodney book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. There's another book on the genocide called We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed. And then there's a great film called The 600 that talks about the fact that it wasn't Kagame who won the war, the forces, the RPA, they're the ones who won.
Okay, I'm just going to say one thing. There was a war. There was a civil war. It actually began as an interstate war when Kagame's army invaded from Uganda. This war went on for nearly 4 years. This is historical fact. Okay. The genocide was the final 100 days of the war. Okay.
Read the book. Read the book. That's all I'm going to say.
You really telling me there was not a war? You really trying to tell me that there was not a 4-year war?
I told you that there was a lot more to it than what you said. I talked about the colonial times.
Oh, yes.
Their role and see, it's important to say that Black people, we're going to take our narrative back about our history. You need to understand that. We're going to take our narrative back and tell our own history the way it actually happened.
Okay,
I'm done.
I believe that at that.
Yeah.
Okay, next is Yusuf. So Yusuf, if you would unmute. Yusuf. Okay, I'm going to go to Raj.
Thank you. And thank you very much. There were I was ignorant of much of what you said. I had assumed it was the Hutus who massacred Tutsis. I didn't look into it enough. And now I suppose Kagame, which army must have been supported by outside forces. But what is most interesting to me is Kagame's role with Israel and Israel as a tool of imperialism. Okay, Israel itself is committing genocide today, and Kagame in this wonderful company that photographs you showed me actually tells me a lot about what's going on, even without your description. So the idea that Europeans divided, that I think that's true. That's what the Europeans did in India, from where I come. But the point is, the present dynamics of imperialism is they are trying to use the fear mongering in the United States in order to advance their control of Africa. I'm talking about and what role Israel is playing in it. Very significant. So thank you very much for that. And any comment you want to make further on it is welcome.
No, I welcome that. The one thing I should say that I want to make absolutely clear is that there was a genocide against the Tutsi. Absolutely was a genocide against the Tutsi. What I'm also saying is that there was also genocide against the Hutu.
Okay, next is Polina, followed by Gerald. So Polina, if you would unmute, please. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Anne. I would like to know, I've heard that the current government of Rwanda takes people on trips here from the US, and it sounds very similar to maybe birthright, but you don't have to be under 25, right? The Israeli thing where, I think people who are progressive here in the United States may have gone on some of these trips. They're sponsored by the government of Rwanda and probably by the US State Department. And it seems like these are indoctrination trips. Could you tell me more about that?
Well, you just described it very well. They're very much like the trips to Israel that are organized, and they promote all the ideology that I've talked about. I'm sure they visit the Holocaust Memorial Museum, see the bones. They're told everything I've been saying. And often, and Kigali, the city of Kigali, Rwanda is sometimes described as a development miracle, but in fact, it's just the gleaming city of Kigali. Outside Kigali, people are very poor. But this development miracle myth is promoted by showing people around this beautiful capital city with a beautiful convention center and so forth that Kagame has constructed. I've heard there's even Wi-Fi on the buses. So people go to Kigali and think it's wonderful. And they learn this whole story. That's, this is very much like the junkets organized to Israel.
Okay, Gerald, if you would unmute, please, and ask your question, maybe turn on your video. Gerald. Hey, you're there you go.
I'm a little slow, okay?
That's okay.
Yeah, I think that what Raj said was kind of important, and that is Kagame's alliance with Israel. That can't bode well for Africa. Now, I think that people should know that Kagame was trained by U.S. military intelligence. And the reason I know is because I thought originally that he was the hero in the situation, and he came in and he stopped the genocide and stuff like. So I worked with Rwandans that were here in America. And to tell you the truth, they were, agents of their government, of course. And I didn't think any negative about that. But just to let you know, when that's where I found out that Kagame had been trained by U.S. military intelligence. But when they discovered that I was pretty open about the point that I'm a socialist, that was it. They stopped contacting me at all. They stopped working with me at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, that's just what happened. That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Anne, any comment? Go ahead.
No, it's,
Oh, okay.
thank you for that, Gerald.
Okay, next
Wait,
is
wait, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
There was
Go ahead.
something I should have said. Yes, it is true that Kagame was trained at the Army Staff College at Fort Leavenworth before he went back and led the invasion of Rwanda from Uganda. That is a place where the Army Staff College at Leavenworth is a place where you go to learn how to plan invasions.
Okay, Yusuf, are you there? I guess not. Okay.
No, he's there.
Oh, there we go. Okay, go ahead, Yusuf.
Okay, just a comment about what you said about Turkey and Israel relations. Actually, it's more of a war of words than a real break. The trade of strategic material, oil, steel, fertilizer that could be made into bombs and so on and so forth, continues basically. There were some restrictions placed only very recently, a couple of weeks ago, but reportedly they could just be sold through third parties, making it a little costlier and more difficult. So, and also there's a strategic relationship of Israel with Azerbaijan, which has a beef with Armenia as well. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, thank you for that. I really don't know much about the current state of that relationship. I just know this one aspect of it, which is that Turkey submitted supporting documents to the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And Israel then said, you're the one guilty of genocide. You're guilty of the Armenian genocide, which was nothing that it had ever acknowledged before.
Yes, but as I said, it's mainly confined towards the Turkish people demand real action. Okay, thank you.
Demand real action on
a comprehensive embargo on trade and cutting off diplomatic relations with Israel. That's
Israel. Okay. Thanks for that.
Okay, next is Gene, followed by James. So Gene, if you would unmute.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Okay, well, thanks so much, Anne. This was really a good talk, and I appreciate everything you're doing there, and also your insights on that. And I just wanted to comment, first of all, in terms of we're talking about genocide, we have to remember that the mother of all genocides occurred right here in the United States, and we're all living on land that was taken from the native people. And I appreciated, I was going to also ask about, Israel doesn't sneeze without getting a handkerchief from the United States and the American role in all this. But I think you did cover that. I saw pictures of our favorite president, of course, Clinton, in there and other things. So I appreciated your coverage of that. What I wanted to comment on or ask about is the role of China on all this, because I used to talk about geopolitics with a neighbor, And he said that, China has never enslaved a single African. And that's true. And that China's impact on Africa has been long-standing, going back to the voyages of the to East Africa, or when Wang Ho led this huge armada there before Vasco da Gama went there. And then you have other impacts like the Bandung Conference and other things, and the Belt and Road Conference. And so have you noticed any impact in terms of China's role in this whole situation in Africa generally, and more specifically with reference to the Rwanda situation? Thank you.
Well, I don't think China was in any way involved at the time of the genocide. It was on the Security Council. It's on the Security Council, but everyone caved and didn't have much choice when the United States decided that it was going to prevent any peacekeeping operation from going in. China now, I don't know of them having any extensive involvement in Rwanda, although I'm sure they're everywhere. But Deborah mentioned the cobalt mines. The cobalt mines are actually in the southeastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's not the conflict zone that I was talking about. The conflict zone I was talking about is in North Kivu province, bordering Rwanda and Uganda. The cobalt mines are now dominated by Chinese interests, and it's not a pretty picture. It was described in a book called Cobalt Red by Siddharth Kara. Horrible working conditions, absolutely conditions like Deborah described. Mothers working in these toxic pits, banging rock as artisanal miners. I personally think, this is, we're getting kind of off topic now, but I personally think that China should do something about this, that the government of China should not be allowing Chinese corporations to exploit labor to this extent. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. But US corporations are there as well. It happens that a large US interest was sold to China. That's, what's his name? Hunter Biden actually profited greatly by that as a middleman. But the other thing to say about China is that in their deals, they exchange infrastructure for minerals. And they don't always do as much building as they say they will, but in exchange for mining leases, they say they're going to build roads and schools, and universities. And they do that rather than cultivating the military command that the US does with AFRICOM, the US Africa Command.
Thank you.
Okay,
I thought
next.
the situation in Uganda, I believe, was kind of negative goings on there. But yeah, it's far from perfect, but certainly not quite the US. Thank you again.
Okay, next is James, if you would unmute, followed by Stefan. So James, please go ahead.
Let me, first I want to thank Anne for introducing me to this history. This about 5-6 years ago, I remember having a talk and realizing I didn't know anything much except the stories about the initial genocide, and didn't know much of the geopolitics of it. So after that, I remember going out and doing a bunch of research and finding all kinds of articles. And the thing that really convinced me to dig a little deeper is Anne gave a talk at a Green Party meeting. And, you know, those Green Party talks, we're lucky if we get 20 people show up. It's a pretty small group. How Rwanda knew about this talk, but they sent 3 people there to harass her at that talk. So it was a really quite interesting situation. I imagine that's what's going on here. I think it's important to to read about this, and in fact that got me to read a couple books, not only Philpott's book, but also Justin Pudor has a really good book, America's War on Democracy in Rwanda and the DR Congo, which gives sort of a larger scale, especially the invasions of the Congo that have been going on by Rwanda, which just keeps that area of Africa so that corporations can continue the exploitation. So it's important to do that. And I think it's also good to look at who's pushing this kind of genocide industrial complex, which is, people like Samantha Power. They push these things so we can have intervention, the kind of intervention that's been done, like in Libya or Yugoslavia. And for Yugoslavia, I think it's a good to understand that and see how it applies elsewhere. Is go read Diana Johnstone's book, Fool's Crusade, because you see how that ethnic strife was used to break that country apart so it could for exploitation. And one thing about the Justin Pudor's book, I think it's important because it really relates the type of racism that's practiced by the West in Africa, and does a great comparison between that and Orientalism, the kind of racism that's practiced in the Middle East. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. And I recommend every single book that James mentioned there. Fool's Crusade about Yugoslavia, America's what is the Justin Porter, the title of the America's Wars on Democracy?
Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the DR Congo. I put it in the too.
Yeah, I reviewed that book. Second to everything James said.
Okay, next is it Stefan or Stephen? Stefan?
Stephen.
Stephen, sorry. It's Stephen. Go
It's
ahead.
all right. It's okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for a very enlightening, presentation. I particularly appreciate the connection between Kagame and the Israelis, and of course the elite American presidents along the line. I have a question for you, and then I have a cautionary remark that I want to make. The question is, I've been trying to make sense of the UK situation in which they want to send Ukraine refugees to Rwanda. And I want to know, I'm trying to make sense of we know that, the Ukraine situation is an imperial proxy war. And so I think that somehow I suspect that there is some historical connection, that might be made in terms of that connection with Rwanda. Why Rwanda, at the moment? And so perhaps that's the question, any enlightenment in terms of that context and how to read that in terms of what is going on in Africa and the African-centered thing would be useful. Secondly, I want to make a cautionary remark about claims about narratives and what narratives are. I'm South African, and you all probably know about Gacha Buthelezi, and in terms of narratives, his narrative was hardly ever a Black narrative or narrative. His narratives were a whole lot more in line with imperialists and colonialists, So, there is a tale, that I say when I look at South Africa, I see South Africans in terms of white South Africans as two types. In South Africa, there are people who are white, and then there are white South Africans. People who are white in South Africa cannot be responsible for their birth and for their position in this world. But white people, on the other hand, were of a particular kind of nature in a particular kind of segregated society and pushed certain ideological and, discriminatory kinds of worldviews. So I think as we talk about kind of, narratives and claims about narratives, we focus on something that is humanistic, that is largely, that takes us out of those narrow prisons of where we are situated. So when we make claims about narratives, we must be cautious about those kind of claims that we make. Thank you.
Cautious about those kinds of claims that we make.
Anne, any comment?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure that. I'm not quite understanding. I mean, I can address the issue of immigrants being shipped out to Rwanda, but I'm not quite sure I understand the caution that you're recommending.
Oh, no. The caution is just a general caution that a remark that I wanted to make. You know, I don't need a response to that. It's the first part that's
okay. You weren't asking for a particular precaution about the narratives that I've been discussing?
no.
Okay.
I'm talking about the narratives that talk about, you know, in terms of, you know, a black narrative and a white narrative or a colonial narrative
Right,
and perspectives in those
okay.
terms.
Okay, thank you. The refugee issue has been the top of the Rwandan news for at least a year. If you haven't heard of this plan, the UK wants to ship refugees to Rwanda, either for resettlement processing or permanent residence. And they'll say right out that what they're trying to do is stop people from getting in boats and crossing the English Channel and trying to get to the UK. There are no bones about that. And there are immigrant advocacy groups who have been fiercely fighting this. The UK Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal according to their laws about protecting refugees, and said that Rwanda was not a safe place for refugees. And now Rishi Sunak is hanging his hat on this. He's absolutely determined to get this passed. This is the first time I've heard of an idea that they were going to deport Ukrainians or send Ukrainians to Rwanda, but you know, maybe so. I have a friend, an Ethiopian friend in the UK who managed to get out of Ethiopia in the last year, and he is terrified now of being deported to Rwanda. Every day, you know, he reads the news feeling doom, and I'm sure there are many immigrants like him. Well, we'll see. There's another legislative move to be made this week. But this is one of the ways in which Rwanda makes itself available for use by Europe. Rwandan troops also serve in various military missions on the continent, like in I think it's Mozambique, where they went to protect the total oil interests. There's an agreement. There's actually an agreement between the EU and Rwanda to make Rwanda a site of export of minerals. These minerals aren't coming from Rwanda; they're coming from the DRC. This business of outsourcing refugees to Rwanda is another sort of service that Rwanda does to Europe. It has happened, and the outcome has not been good. Rishi Sunak is determined to make it institutional and start. He hopes to start shipping refugees to Rwanda by the beginning of the summer. He was trying for spring. Now he's trying for the beginning of summer. It's still tied up in Parliament. The immigrant advocacy groups say that they will sue if Parliament passes the legislation. Rwanda will be paid a great deal of money for accepting these refugees.
Okay, next is Mehmet, if you would unmute, followed by Richard. So Mehmet, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Anne, for a great presentation. When you started talking about the genocides, which I think should be a subject that we should all maybe get together and form a panel and discuss about, because as you mentioned, the Armenian genocide was the first modern genocide that happened in the 20th century, and it looks like it became a model for other genocides. But the important thing here is that what leads to these genocides? As you mentioned, in Rwanda, it was the end of the war, a 4-year war. In Turkey, where the Armenians were massacred and, really done away with, was the beginning of the war. And the Turks, actually, the ruling classes, were just happy that the First World War had started, because that would give them an opportunity to kill their own citizens, completely destroy the culture, but hide it behind the excuse of, well, there was a war, there was, nothing we could do, and they started stabbing us in the back, and we had to do it. So that's a very interesting thing. And Israel, for a long time, did not accept the Armenian genocide, because they wanted to hold the monopoly of having been the only people on earth that experienced the Holocaust. So they did not want anybody else sharing the misery that they have. And Yusuf mentioned before me how the Turkish government today plays a double-faced role, as there's a flotilla that is about to leave Turkey, again, a help flotilla to Palestine. But just yesterday, a Turkish minister went on to say that war is something else, trade is something else, because Turkey is the main provider of like Yusuf said, steel and water, food, oil, all of those things, and including the government's very, very high officials, families and sons involved in this trade. But to the people in Turkey, they keep on giving the, they're attacking the Palestinians, we're going to support the Palestinians. But one thing else is that, again, coming back to the concept of genocide, is that with Armenian genocide, it opened up to the world that it was okay. As Hitler said about the Armenian genocide, who is now remembering the Armenians? So that was a model. That was given so that other nations could do the genocides. And today, coming back to the immigrants and the way they are going to be shipped to Rwanda, Turkey is being paid billions of dollars by Europe to hold the refugees there. And internally now, there's like about 13 million refugees in Turkey from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, everywhere. And now this has started a crisis of racism in Turkey, as people who are darker skinned are being attacked every day. Now racism has become like a very normal thing. Just, your people speaking just regularly express their racist views of how these people should be killed and sent back and this and that. There are many African students in Turkey. Turkey has opened up universities for these students. They don't mean anything. They don't teach anything. But African students come to Turkey to get education, and the girls are raped and killed, and the government does nothing about this. So this racist environment is like something waiting to explode. So that's why other genocides are going to happen if we don't study what genocides have done and what caused the genocides. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Any comment, Ann?
No, thank you for that.
Okay. All right. Next is Richard Wright, if you would unmute. And I'd ask people to raise your hand, go down to the reactions button. If you have questions or comments, please join in. We're almost at the end here.
Oh, okay. I've been talking for a long time. I need to excuse myself for just a minute. I'll be right back.
Okay. Okay. We'll take a quick break. Again, I just want to remind everybody, if you go to our website at ICSSmarks.org, we've actually been doing these programs for about 15 years now. Since we've gone on, since the pandemic started, we have been on Zoom, and we have participants and speakers from all over the world. Quite a rich variety of programs. There are links to video presentations that are up on YouTube from our website, ICSSmarks.org. And also you can sign up for future announcements and to get a Zoom link. Next week, we do have this program from South Korea. Actually, Daehan is going to be speaking. It's going to be from 2:30 a.m. until after 4 a.m., which will be really quite the something. But he's making the extra effort. We think it's very important for people to tune in and find out. There have been some developments on the peninsula. I understand that the DPRK has said that they no longer consider South Korea as a partner for negotiations. Very, very serious development. So please come back and join us next week for our program. Thank you, Ed, for returning. Next up is Richard. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and thank you for an interesting presentation. This is an area that I certainly don't pay attention to on a regular basis. I should more than I do. Of course, Africa is one of the last remaining areas, I think, for the race for resources amongst the major countries. I include China, Russia, United States, the Western European. In particular, I'm kind of wondering, recently, the MERIP, Middle Eastern Report Information Project, I think, MERIP, has an issue on Sudan. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's on my to-do list. And Sudan became in focus a couple of months ago as a consequence of Prigozhin and his group in that area. So I was wondering if you could maybe comment on the nature of the Russian involvement, the Russian influence in that area. Thank you very much.
Okay, I know about that MERIP report. That's on my list too. I haven't yet read it. And I have to say, I'm no expert on what's been going on in Sudan. As to Russia, I think you're asking basically about Russia on the continent. About all I can say is that they're, like the Chinese, offering Africa another negotiating partner. And in the countries in West Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they're all turning to Russia for some help. That's really about all I can say about that at this point. The only pernicious episode that I actually know about is in, I think it was Guinea, one of the only resources that Russia doesn't have. Russia is hugely resource rich. So Russia doesn't have to be seeking resources all over the world the way that China and the US do. China is resource poor. US is now relatively resource poor. Russia is extremely resource rich. It has most everything needed by modern industry, including a lot of oil. One thing it lacks is bauxite, and it was kind of aggressive about going after the bauxite in Guinea. So that's about all I know.
Okay, we're almost wrapping up here. Raj, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just couldn't find what is the proportion of between Tutsi and Hutus now in Rwanda after all that has happened. And I know that they were set up against each other by imperialists with things, but was there any reconciliation process like it happened in South Africa, happened in Rwanda? What can you tell us about that?
Well, I'm sure Deborah would say that there's been a very effective reconciliation process. I don't believe that. I published a WikiLeaks cable that was, I think may have been as far back as 2008, 2010, something like that. I'd have to go and check it. But what it revealed, it was a cable written by a U.S. diplomat in the country. And she described a very perilous situation because she said that, well, first I should explain. Okay, the Tutsi population is about 14%. The Hutu population is the rest. And the Twa Pygmies are about 1%.
So Tutsi is by far the largest population.
Oh, no, Tutsi is about 14%. Hutu is most of the rest.
Oh, okay.
There is a population of Twa Pygmies who are about maybe 1%.
But Tutsi's leader or other aristocrat is now ruling.
Yeah, they're an elite minority. But it's as Deborah said, you're not most of the time supposed to talk about Tutsis and Hutus and Twas. Although in his speech at the 30th commemoration, the president talked about these distinctions. Excuse me, I've been talking too long. Again and again and again. This WikiLeaks cable that I'm talking about said that Tutsis occupied all the top positions in the government, although there were some Hutus there, but in each case where a Hutu occupied a high position, he was paired with a Tutsi who had the real authority. I don't think that the reconciliation processes have been genuine or successful. Deborah would disagree with me vehemently, I'm sure.
Deborah, you want to comment?
Yes, I would. I actually have met people who exemplify the success of what they call them, the gachacha courts, because of the extensive death and destruction. I mean, there were bodies like rotting in the streets for like literally years. That's how extensive and thoroughgoing the death and destruction were. So the country had to develop these community courts where they invited perpetrators and victims to come together, and perpetrators were invited to confess their acts and ask for forgiveness in a genuine way. And that actually happened. And from my understanding, that's actually been pretty successful. I've actually met people from a village in which perpetrators and those who were victimized by them lived side by side. I met a woman whose family was killed by her neighbor. Her neighbor confessed, asked for forgiveness, was granted forgiveness, and then later asked the daughter of this same woman whose kids had been killed by him, if the daughter would be the godparents to his children. That's not an unusual story. You'll find people who are married, and one the family of one may have killed the family of the other spouse, and yet they find a way to come together. Friends, buddies, you know, so it's not just spouses, it's friends. So my father killed, you know, your dad. Can we still be friends? And it happens. So I can't speak to underlying simmering hostilities, but I have seen miraculous examples of was the word rapprochement. I refuse to speak French because of, but yeah, reconciliation, if you will. Now, I will say this, the first day that I came to Kigali, I went to the bank, and I just mentioned this to my banker. I was disturbed by the fact that I saw tall, thin, medium-skinned women working there. And I said, we're the short, dark people. So that's my code for Hutus, okay? And I did say, I said, if the country does not address this and make sure that everyone knows that there are opportunities to advance, you will have a problem in the future. So I'm certainly not saying Rwanda is perfect. It is not. But I think they've done some wonderful, miraculous things.
So Deborah, you have moved from the United States. You're an American citizen who's living in Rwanda?
Correct.
Okay, and you moved there for what reason?
Donald Trump.
Oh, Donald Trump, okay.
I didn't like the direction I saw the country going. It's frightening. I still wonder about whether it's going to end up fascist or not. I'm not betting that it won't. And I just, you know, this age, after being someone who was in the struggle for, you know, over 50 years, I thought, you know, I deserve a break, and I need to find a place where I can live in peace. And I need to find a country whose values speak to me, and the values of Rwanda spoke to me.
Okay, it's 12:30. Yeah, go ahead.
Say something about the Gacaca courts. My understanding is that the Gacaca courts are not true reconciliation, and that for one thing, only Hutus are asked to ask for forgiveness from Tutsis. And as I said, there was also a Hutu genocide, which is not acknowledged. Tutsis are not asked to apologize to Hutus.
So let me ask you this. People like to talk about the genocide. Well, we don't like to talk about, but the German genocide against the Jewish people. It's always against the Jewish people. But if we know that trade unionists were targeted, we know that LGBTQ people were targeted, but we don't criticize Israel for not including those populations when they talk about the genocide. So I guess I'm just wondering what gives us the right to define for other countries how they should characterize their experiences.
Okay. The evidence in the books and the research that I've cited and everything I know else I have learned about Rwanda caused me to believe that there was a Hutu genocide on the scale of the Tutsi genocide. I don't know what else I can say about that, really.
Well, you could address the question about why we aren't criticizing Israel for not talking about what the Nazis did to the LGBTQ people and trade unionists.
Well, I think
to me, it's very parallel. It's parallel.
Okay. I think they do. I don't know of,
No,
I think pretty much it's pretty
the
much
Jewish people. It's the Jewish people.
Yeah, but it's acknowledged. It's widely acknowledged that LGBT people, also
this is silly.
particularly, other groups were included in the Holocaust. I think that's widely known. I don't think
Excuse me, Anne. I went to a concentration camp that was preserved as a museum in Germany. And in fact, they had a red star for communists, a purple star, a yellow star for Jews. They had different categories. The Nazis had different categories on the prisoners' suits for, excuse me, for, you know, different so-called offenders, gays, etc. This is widely known.
Yes.
I don't know what Deborah's, you know what, maybe Deborah's right that Americans are not aware, and as we are not aware of so much. But in fact, when I visited the concentration camp, I learned. Finish.
Okay, yeah, this is not suppressed history. The Hutu genocide is suppressed history.
Okay,
I think we're also working on. Sorry, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
We're also having a conversation and an in-depth look at something that's within a category of genocide. And most of the kind of evidence that has been produced, or at least the presentations on things that's been about genocide, genocidal actions in that way. And while it might be true, there might be various other kinds of social criminal acts and injustices. You know, those are different categories of things. And by confusing these categories, you know, we just digress into some things that, you know, that devolves into something chaotic. So this is a categorical kind of contradiction in terms of raising such issues, various other side issues. It becomes a categorical contradiction to what we are focused on in terms of the topic before us and what we are examining and enlightening ourselves about.
Right. Reconciliation is a self-deceptive imperialist tool. Because there's no other choice except the horror that we have to live with, and somehow we have to encompass that, so we kind of go along with it. But it's the same stuff as always. You do not get over that horrible anguish. I'm 88 and I've still got the Holocaust and I still got the bomb. There's no reconciliation.
I agree. You know, we create these rituals to get us through, you know, nothing more than that. Thank you.
Okay, so it's 12:35. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. We want to invite everybody to come back next week. Thank you, Anne, so much for speaking today. Thank you, everybody, for the great questions, for coming on. And we hope to see you all back in the future. So.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.